Welcome to Lesson 2. This week we're going to talk about risk management planning. Our learning objectives for this week will be to explain methods of mitigating risk by managing threats, vulnerabilities, and exploits. Describe the components of an effective organizational risk management program. Our key concepts for the week, as you can read on the charts here, is basically risk, threats, vulnerabilities, and exploits, public resources for risk management. And there are a lot of tools out there that we'll touch on here shortly. The use of threat vulnerability pairs in managing risk, fundamental components of risk management plan, objectives for a risk management plan, objectives and scope of a risk management plan, importance of assigning responsibilities. Now this one is a touchy subject in a lot of organizations. There are many people, whether it's technicians or managers of certain areas, if they get pulled into certain areas when it comes to assigning responsibilities, you'll see a lot of heads turn, I guess, if you will. And then we'll talk about the significance of planning, scheduling, and documentation. So, per our weekly reading, let's go ahead and start with Chapter 2, Managing Risk, Threats, Vulnerabilities, and Exploits. So the uncontrollable nature of threats, as we've learned earlier, threats are something that's out there, but it's not actually something that has happened. And so threats can't be eliminated. There's, the book in the previous chapter, Lesson 1, talked about a thunderstorm and lightning. Well, there's a threat of lightning and thunderstorms through the thunderstorms, but if lightning doesn't strike, then you don't actually have an exploit or a vulnerability there, but you do have the threat of lightning. And so as long as the threat's there, it's just that. It's just a threat. Threats are always present. There's nothing we can do about them. You can take action to reduce the potential for a threat to occur. You can take action to reduce the impact of a threat. You cannot affect the threat itself. So unintentional threats, basically they're in, your environmental, your human, your accidents, your failures. These are all things that are not purposeful, although the human factor can be purposeful, especially when you have insider threats that untrustworthy people in your organization that all they want to do is bring malcontent on the organization. And so maybe sabotage and things like that. But 9 times out of 10, believing in the goodness of somebody's heart and believing they're going to do the right thing when you hire them, most of these things will happen through accidents or failures or just out of ignorance of just not knowing. So basically a threat is any activity that presents a possible danger. This includes any circumstances or events with the potential to adversely impact confidentiality, integrity, or availability of a business's assets. So let's try to move on to the next slide. Here we go. So as we mentioned, a threat is any activity that represents a possible danger. This includes any circumstances or events with the potential to adversely impact confidentiality, integrity, or availability of a business's assets. Threats are a part of the equation that creates risk, which basically means risk is equal to vulnerability times the threat. So any attempt to manage risk requires a thorough knowledge of threats. This section that we're going to cover in this book, especially Chapter 2, out of Lesson 2 readings, requires a thorough knowledge of threats. And so we're going to touch on the uncontrollable nature of threats, the unintentional threats, the intentional threats, and the best practices for managing threats within your IT infrastructure. So the uncontrollable nature of threats. Let me go back one here. Okay, so the uncontrollable nature of threats, it's important to realize a few basic facts about threats. These include, as we mentioned, threats can't be eliminated. They're always present. And if you look at the unintentional threats, especially the environmental, as we mentioned, thunderstorms, there's tornadoes, there's floods, and then, of course, there's the human factor where people can unintentionally do things to, bring in a threat, make a threat real in an organization. For instance, let's say you have an employee that clicks on an email that has a macro virus in it. And as I mentioned in the earlier lecture from last week, the Melissa virus from years ago was a macro that would, basically copy all of the contacts from one person's account and then email everybody on that list. And as it would just keep going and going and going, it would multiply. Well, if somebody, unknowingly clicks on one of those, and there you have it. You have a macro virus on your hands and within the organization. Accidents always happen. We can always try to prevent accidents by, through educating our employees or the employees of the organization, for things that they might unintentionally do. But we could also set up an environment to where accidents are less likely to happen. And then obviously there are failures. We have to learn from the failures. We can try to prevent them, based on past knowledge of the organization and what we know in the IT infrastructure. What can harm systems, what cannot harm systems, what's the best practices to do things. And then once we figure these things out, failures can be less likely. But you're always going to have failures. There's nothing you're going to be able to do about those other than try to prevent them from happening. So your intentional threats. These are things like greed, anger, desire to damage. You have people in organizations that hopefully by doing a background check on an employee, one of the first things they check is the financial backgrounds of different people. I know when I went to work with the federal government back in 2010, as some of the millennials like to call it, is we had to undergo an extensive background check, especially with a security clearance and especially at the top secret level. One of the first things they check is your financial background, and they run an extensive check on that with all your creditors, possible debts, debt to income ratio. They look at your habits, whether you drink, smoke, like to hang out at bars, that kind of stuff, because, the old saying is loose lips sink ships. And so they feel that if people like to drink, they like to talk. So fortunately for me, I don't drink, so that sort of helped me out in that category. But they also, check your credit history and see if you're overextended and those kind of things, because they look for people that may end up, that would be an insider threat, that would that all they want is more money, more money, more money, to maybe manipulate the system to transfer cash or assets to their accounts or somehow benefit them. Whether it's, if you're, for instance, there have been cases in the DOD where, let's say, employee X was good friends with contractor B, and there's a proposal in the works, and let's say employee X and contractor B sort of collude together and say, hey, you can hand me this contract and I'll give you some kickbacks. And so those are the things that you have to look for in the organization. So extensive background checks is one of the things that can help with the greed factor. Also, a lot of people don't practice this, and I know one thing, when I worked with the DOD for 6 years as an information assurance manager, one of the things that I did not see and is an effective tool is to do mandatory vacations. Sometimes you'll see this in the accounting side of things, the financial side of things, when basically, okay, you have a forced vacation coming up and they bring somebody in your spot to take over your job, for the week or 2 weeks that you're out. And basically this is like an internal audit, especially if the person coming in comes in and does things by the book and they notice some odd things out there. They're like, well, okay, this isn't right, and so it starts throwing up red flags. If you by some chance are not doing things by the book, if you're taking shortcuts, and so that lets management know, it's like, hey, okay, this person, they're doing a good job and we haven't noticed anything out of the ordinary, but we brought somebody in to do the job, through mandatory vacations or mandatory leave, and by the book, this person is sort of like our internal auditor, and we notice things aren't lining up. And so that can prompt an investigation into that position. You always have anger. You have angry employees, and I sort of put anger and desire to damage. Basically all three of these, greed, anger, desire to damage, I kind of it's equivalent to me as sabotage. And so you always have angry, disgruntled employees, especially if they're fired or let go. They want to sabotage things before they leave. So a lot of companies, when they're getting ready to dismiss employees, they will call them to the front office or have a meeting with them, and then immediately when they're dismissed, we'll have them escorted by security basically out of the premises, and all of their stuff is boxed up by an external person, not the person that owns it. They're not allowed to go back into the building. The person that was dismissed, they're not allowed to go back in. They've lost all access to the building. So someone from the organization will box up all of their stuff, and then they will have it shipped to their house. They will not have the employee come back and pick them up. It's not recommended to do that because you're just setting yourself up for an altercation, if the employee is indeed that angry. So a lot of these people, they'll have their stuff shipped to them. And so that's one thing that human resources and organizations do to protect themselves against angry, disgruntled employees, that kind of thing. And, for the desire to damage, I kind of look at that as sabotaging the framework, whether it's injecting bad influence on other employees within the IT infrastructure, or if they see a framework that's in place. I know we're talking about the COVID framework this week in this lesson. And, there's some videos out there that I put out there last week in Lesson 1, but there's also the same videos if you didn't get a chance to watch them. Please go out and watch them. There's a link in Lesson 2 that talks about the COVID 5 enablers, and it's a very good framework. But let's say, for instance, somebody didn't like that framework and they want to veer from that and do their own thing. Well, that's sort of a desire to damage, or let's say that management says, okay, we're doing this, and then you have an IT staff that says, no, we're not. And so we're going to do this. It's probably not the best example in the world, but that's the best I can think of at this moment. So on the anger thing, basically, when anger is the motivator, an attacker often wants the victim to pay a price. Anger can result in attempts to destroy assets or disrupt operations. These threats often result in loss of availability. In other words, downtime. I know we mentioned the web servers last week. Let's say, for instance, during the lunch hours, right after lunch, during 1 to 3 is your biggest sales hours on a Tuesday. And let's say a hacker or an attacker comes in and brings down your site, then whether it's denial of service or cross-site scripting, whatever, they can set up a basically making it to where your website is unavailable during that time, and you've lost thousands of potential sales between 1 and 3 because the attacker wants to bring down your system. They don't like how you're making money. They don't like how you do your sales. They'll find something that they don't like. And so basically some attackers just want to cause damage. The result is the same as if an attacker is motivated by anger. It can result in a loss of availability. So you see where I can put all of these three pretty much in the same category. And so some of the common attackers today, based on your textbook, says, there are criminals, opportunities to make money from online attacks have resulted in a growth of criminal activity. Furthermore, criminal activity is far more organized today. This activity includes fraud and theft. For example, rogueware tricks users into installing bogus antivirus software. Then they must pay to get it removed. And you see that a lot in ransomware today, where the victims are, the attacker will go in and take control of their files. And basically, if you have any files that, whether it's on the cloud or whether it's in a folder that's maybe encrypted, a lot of times it doesn't matter if they gain access to your system and your user ID and your password have gained access to the system. Once they have your user ID and your password, they're able to go in and lock those files and encrypt those files with their encryption. And so basically they're not able to, once they lock those files with those encryption files, people will go in and try to open those files, and they cannot. And so they'll get a little text document that says, okay, if you want to open these files, you'll contact us at this, and you'll pay this amount of money. And so until that's paid, you're not able to get your files back. And so there are things to safeguard against things like that. But anyway, just like rogueware, there's ransomware. There's your advanced persistent threats, your APIs or APTs. Attackers focus on a specific target. APTs have high levels of expertise and almost unlimited resources. Nation states or terrorist groups often sponsor them. So they attack both government and private agencies. Operation Aurora is an example of an APT attack. Investigations indicate that the APT attack originated from China. It attacked several private companies such as Google. A McAfee white paper titled Revealed, Operation Shady Rat, discussed the 71 different APT attacks. 21 of these were government targets. 50 were private companies. Of course, you always have your vandals, you have your saboteurs, and then, as we mentioned, your disgruntled employees, you have your activists. Of course, there are other nations that want to do harm to other nations. And then, of course, your typical hackers. As we mentioned on the unintentional versus the intentional, as you can see, the unintentional, the environmental, fire, wind, lighting, flooding. I believe that meant to say lightning instead of flooding, so I might need to let the publisher know that that's maybe a misprint there. Accident, equipment failures. On the human side, you have keystroke errors, procedural errors, programming bugs. My wife's a software engineer, so with me being a technical person and doing vulnerability, so we kind of go back and forth on how programmers need to step up their games a little bit. So as you can see, I stay in a doghouse sometimes. Individuals or organizations, that's the intentional threats. There's hackers, criminals, disgruntled employees, and on and on. We won't dwell on this any longer, so let's move on. Your common attackers, we just mentioned that. I think I'm a slide or two behind. I'm sort of getting ahead of myself, so I'll try to keep up with the slides. So basically, the best practices for managing threats. There are many steps that you can take to manage threats within the typical IT infrastructure. The following list that we're going to talk about represents steps that IT security professionals consider best practices. And usually best practices means it's been studied, it's been practiced, it's been put into practice, it's been performed, and it has desirable results. And so usually that's what best practices means. So basically creating a security policy. And boy, this is always fun. I can remember working for the DoD as an information assurance management officer. One of the first things when we had to certify a system or accredit a system, certify and accredit can mean two separate things. So let me clarify that when we accredit systems, that means we had to go through the certification process. Certification and accreditation, which sometimes we call CNA. We had to create security policies, and essentially it starts from the top. Senior management identifies and supports the role of security and creates a security policy. This policy provides a high-level overview of the goals of security, but not details of how to implement security techniques. So basically, managers use this policy to identify resources and create plans to implement the policy. So security policies are an important first step, in reducing the impact from threats. Once the security policy is approved, it needs to be implemented and enforced. The enforcement part can be, there's probably another plan for that one. But the second thing, best practice for managing threats is purchase insurance. Purchase insurance to reduce the impact of threats. Companies commonly purchase insurance for fire, theft, and losses due to environmental threats. But there's also, a new thing out now, and it's gaining a lot of steam, is cyber insurance. So, for instance, the Targets, the Verizons, the different, your bigger financial institutes that are your consumer institutions, Walmart, eBay, some of these will actually purchase the cyber insurance, so in case they're hacked, they have something to fall back on. So if they're out millions of dollars, then the insurance would pay it instead of it coming out of the company profits. So the use of access controls basically require users to authenticate, grant users access only to what they need. And so a lot of times you'll see the role-based access control based on the person's role, if they're in finance or if they're in human resource, if they're in IT, whatever other department you may have, then they need to have access to their resources, and only a very few, like human resources, may need to have access to some financial access records, and vice versa, from those departments. But you don't want to just give somebody free rein and let them go to every different department. What are they working here? What are they working on here? What are they working on there? Those are not very good practices. So basically, the principle of least privilege is probably the best possible access that you can give people. Basically only the rights and permissions they need to perform their job and no more. This prevents users from accidentally or intentionally causing problems. So sometimes we like to caution on the side of trust, and I'm one of those people. I'll trust you until you give me a reason not to. And so, but a lot of times we can prevent this from quote unquote accidentally or intentionally causing problems by only giving that person the access and rights permission to exactly what they need. And so, there's also the principle of need to know under the access controls. Grant users access only to the data they need to perform their jobs and no more. For example, a person may have a security clearance for secret data. However, that person doesn't automatically receive access to all secret data. Instead, the person is granted access only to what he or she needs for their job. This helps prevent unauthorized access, and the DoD, having a top secret clearance and having access to different programs. As an administrator, I was read on to some of these projects, and only people that had access to these projects were people that acknowledged and were able to do the or basically had a need to know for that project. And people that were not, quote-unquote, read on the project didn't know about the project. So you see how that works. You can use automation. Automate processes as much as possible to reduce human error. And we'll talk about that more as we dive into the book and some of the lessons and labs that we'll talk about. We'll talk about the automation side of things, so how to prevent human errors and sort of take the human process out, especially when you can automate the configuration systems for your networking processes, and take those unintentionally a systems administrator or network administrator may leave out a step until they find out later on, like, oh man, I should have went back and checked this box or made this setting. Basically include input validation. Test data to determine if it is valid before any applications use it. Provide training. Use training to increase safety awareness and reduce accidents. I'm one of these that you educate the workforce. And that's one of the best ways that you can, when educating the workforce, you can at least increase their security awareness and reduce security incidents. And of course, your typical use antivirus software, and protect the boundary between the internet and the internet with a firewall at a minimum. You can use intrusion detection systems for an added layer. These are some of the things that you can do to help prevent. But a security policy may include several individual policies. For example, it could include a password policy, an acceptable use policy, a firewall policy. And so a lot of us, if we work for any type of company that has internet access, they should have, when you first hired in, you should have had to have signed an acceptable use policy. Some people call it the AUP. And so that says, okay, you're only allowed to do your job, and you're to access your files and blah, 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 and you agree to not use the system for personal gain and blah, 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 whatever the acceptable use policy is for that particular organization. Some of us, I know I had to sign one every year, one for the DoD side and one for the organization that I work for. And so the organization's AUP referenced the DoD and complemented, but it went into further detail of what I could do and could not do within that organization. So Let's go to the next one. Understanding and managing vulnerabilities. Countermeasures reduce risk and loss, reduce vulnerabilities, and reduce impact of loss. And so a vulnerability can be a weakness in an asset or the environment. You can also consider a weakness as a flaw in any system or any business process. A vulnerability leads to a risk, but by itself it does not become a loss. The loss only occurs when a threat exploits the vulnerability. This is also referred to as a threat-vulnerability pair. So as we can see in the figure you have on the page here, threat, vulnerability, risk, loss, and then of course you have the mitigation techniques is reaching out to vulnerability and loss. It basically shows the flow of a threat to a loss. You can use mitigation techniques to reduce the vulnerability, the loss, or both. The flow of threat-vulnerability pairs is basically occurs when a threat exploits a vulnerability, as we just mentioned. The vulnerabilities provide a path for the threat and results in a harmful event or a loss. It's important to know that both the threat and the vulnerability must come together to result in a loss. Vulnerabilities depend on your organization. For example, if you're hosting public-facing servers, the servers have several potential weaknesses. However, if you don't have any public-facing servers, there aren't any vulnerabilities for the organization in this area. Thus, the risk is zero. I promised I would keep up with the slides instead of getting ahead of myself, but I don't guess I did that, so my apologies. Basically in the book, page 56 in Chapter 2, Table 2.1 shows the threat, the vulnerability, and the harmful event or the loss. And for example, the threat is a fire, the vulnerability is the lack of fire detection and suppression equipment, and the harmful event or loss can be the total loss of a business. And so let's move down to like an internal, like malware. That's the threat, but the vulnerability can be lack of antivirus software, outdated definitions, those type things. And so the harmful event or loss in that aspect would be the infection. Impact of loss determined by the payload of the malware. How many devices did it reach, and how many, and what level of work did it bring down? Like for instance, was it manager A that has tons of work that needs to get out versus employee A or employee B that only feeds the data to them? So, so basically, the threat, the vulnerability pair can lead to a system infection and, possibly bring down several employees. Vulnerabilities can be mitigated. You can mitigate or reduce vulnerabilities, which reduces potential risk. The risk reduction comes from one of the following: reducing the rate of occurrence or reducing the impact of the loss. And let me, there we go. All right, so some of the mitigation techniques, you can use a wide variety of mitigation techniques in any enterprise. As you explore the techniques in this chapter, you want to keep the following elements in mind: the value of the technique, the initial cost of the technique, and the ongoing cost. So one of the things that you have to do when you're mitigating techniques is you have to look at its value, the cost of it, and how much is it going to cost you in the future if you keep implementing this practice. So yes, I did say practice instead of technique. A lot of times those are interchangeable. For example, antivirus software has an initial cost. The initial cost includes a subscription for updates for a period of time, such as a year. When the subscription expires, it must be renewed. When estimating the value and cost of any of these techniques or practices, you can consider the value of the resource and the impact of the loss. For example, training in basic social engineering tactics may cost you $10,000 a year. However, if users don't receive the training, the company may lose $100,000. This indicates the value of the training is $90,000. However, there are other variables to consider when estimating the value of a mitigation technique. A company may have lost $100,000 last year. If people are trained, the company estimates it will only lose $5,000 this year. This would give a value of $85,000 to the training. And so here's how we would calculate that. So last year's loss minus the training cost minus this year's loss, or 100,000 minus 10,000 minus 5,000 equals 85,000. And so we're going to talk about the policies and procedures on the vulnerability mitigation techniques. Your policies and procedures, written policies and procedures provide standards. These standards make it clear what should be implemented and how. Many organizations start by creating a security policy, as mentioned earlier, and you should review the policies and procedures on a regular basis to see if these policies are effective and if they're working. I know as an information assurance manager for the DoD, and even as a contractor before I became to work with the federal government, we always had to review security policies and procedures and things to see, as times change, then so should your policies and procedures to keep up with the emerging technologies and the different people coming in, and as lessons learned. I believe every organization should have a lessons learned journal to say, okay, well, this employee did this, but we didn't know that they could do this, and so here's how we would stop this in the future, and so that's a lessons learned. So you could always implement that into your policies and procedures. Documentation, that's always useful in a wide number of areas. None of us like doing it, but make sure it's up to date. Especially for up-to-date documentation of networks, especially it makes the problems easier to troubleshoot. Once problems occur, you can repair them more quickly. And as we mentioned, training helps employees basically understand that security is everybody's responsibility. And some training is geared to all users. Other training must be targeted to the specific users, for their specialties, their departments, and things that they have access to. And as we mentioned, separation of duties. That's the principle, basically the separation of principles duties principle ensures that any single person does not control all of the functions of a critical process. It's basically designed to prevent fraud, theft, and errors. For example, accounting separates accounts receivables from accounts payable. One division accepts and approves bills. The other division pays the approved bills. Separation of duties also helps prevent conflicts of interest. And boy, this is always the fun one. Configuration management. Basically, when system configuration is standardized, systems are easier to troubleshoot and maintain. One method of configuration management is to use baselines. For example, you can configure a system and then create a system image. You can deploy that image to 100 other systems, so every system is identical. I'm a firm believer in baselining, so that way, especially if you have a vibrant organization that has, several, I say several, which means 50 or more employees, if all their systems are set up the same, then when they call the help desk, then your help desk personnel know, or your IT personnel know, okay, well, this person's in this department, they have this baseline image, and so we know if they're having problems with this system, then we can work on the image and try to mimic that problem, and then we can correct it. So configuration management is a biggie. Version controls. When multiple people work on the same document or the same application, data can be lost or corrupt. So version control systems are commonly used with the development of applications. They track all changes and can reduce wasted time and effort, especially if changes need to be reversed. So you don't want somebody using product A that's version 1.0, and the new employees coming in, they're assigned version 3.0. Well, you know, is there a conflict? Is there a potential of conflict there, or, you know, basically you need to fix it. And so your basic intrusion detection, your IDS, is designed to detect threats. It cannot prevent a threat. A passive IDS will log the event and may provide an alert. An active IDS may modify the environments to block the attack after it is deleted. Many IDS systems use definitions the way antivirus software uses signatures. So a network-based intrusion detection system, which is a lot of times we call a NIDS, provides overall network protection. A host-based intrusion detection, we refer to as HIDS, can protect individual systems. Incident response. These are some of the things that you'll learn later on in the class. So basically, you know, if a company is prepared for an incident that happens, they can respond to it quickly and, you know, try to fix the immediate issue without addressing the underlying problem. When you address underlying problems, you reduce the chance of recurring incidents for the same issue. So basically, when a company is prepared and able to respond to an incident, it has a better chance to reduce the impact. An important step when responding to an incident is containment. So, for instance, if a person, you know, has excuse me for a moment. So if a person has a virus on the computer, one of the first things you'll do is disconnect that computer from the network. So that way that way it cannot be distributed among other computers and coworkers, and that way we've contained that problem. Continuous monitoring is security work is never finished, so continuous monitoring is necessary. You implement controls and then check and audit to ensure they are still in place. I know that's one of the biggest things when I was with the DoD risk management framework was continuous monitoring, and that way, you know, people can keep up with what's happening within their systems. You could always implement technical controls. There's physical controls, prevent unauthorized personnel from having physical access areas to your systems. And so with that, so the best practices for managing vulnerabilities within your IT infrastructure is, one, you need to identify the vulnerabilities. And two, you need to match the threat vulnerability pairs, just as we mentioned earlier. Use as many of the mitigation techniques as feasible. And we mentioned some of those earlier. Basically it's possible to use all the techniques that we've talked about, depending on your IT infrastructure, and you could always use more. So basically, you know, with multiple techniques in place, you've ultimately created multiple layers of security. So then you can perform vulnerability assessments, can help you identify weaknesses. You can perform them internally or hire experts to perform them for you. And I've known organizations to do both. And there are advantages and disadvantages to both, but we won't discuss that in this chapter. Okay, so an exploit is so let's go to understanding and managing exploits. An exploit is the act of taking advantage of a vulnerability. Um, it does so by executing a command or program against an IT system to take advantage of a weakness. The result is a compromise to the system, an application, or data. You can also think of an exploit as an attack executed by code. In this context, an exploit primarily attacks a public-facing server. In other words, it attacks servers that are available on the Internet. Common Internet servers are web servers, your SMTP email server, Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, or your File Transfer Protocol, which is FTP servers. Um, and as you can see, some of the exploits attacking public-facing servers is you have a buffer overflow, SQL injection, denial of service attack, the DOS, or the designated denial of service, DDoS attack. These are various ones. So risk mitigation techniques for protecting public-facing servers: remove or change defaults. In other words, remove the guest account and rename the administrator account, and change the default password to a complicated password or complex password. Basically reduce your footprint. Try not to be as noticed out there as say, hey, look at me, come attack me. And so you want to keep your systems up to date. As we mentioned, there's patch management, there's vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and if you're doing continuous monitoring, you should be keeping the system up to date. And then, as we mentioned earlier, enable the firewalls. These are some of the best practices that can happen. Enable your IDSs, your intrusion detection systems. Enable intrusion prevention systems, which is IPSs. Install antivirus software. These are some of the basic things that an organization can do to help protect itself. And the best practice for managing exploits: harden your servers. Make the security more difficult for an attacker to get into your servers. So use configuration management. The version controls that we talked about. Those are some of the things that, know what hardware and versions you have, and, whether they're legacy or up-to-date systems. Perform risk assessments, and then perform vulnerability assessments. And so, basically the U.S. government risk management initiatives, we talked about this a little bit last week. There's the NIST, Homeland Security, the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center, the NCCIC, the U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team, the U.S. CERT, had to deal with those folks quite a bit. The MITRE Corporation, Common Vulnerabilities Exposure, CVE list. One of the contractors that worked for me happened to be the MITRE Corporation, and so a very broad organization, that keeps the CVE list there. The relationships among your organizations, as you can see the flow here, how each one, Department of Commerce, Homeland Security, which one falls under which category here. Wow, and that was all Chapter 2. That's amazing there, isn't it? 50 minutes of gibberish is what it seems like, right? So Chapter 4, we'll talk about developing a risk management plan, and we won't touch on this a whole lot. This chapter, we'll start building on it here in the short future with in lessons to come, where it's talking about the business impact analysis and just different things involved with a risk management plan. It's so complex that it takes a team of individuals to tackle. So objectives of a risk management plan, we'll talk about you have to have the list of threats, a list of vulnerabilities, costs associated with the risk, a list of recommendations to reduce the risk, costs associated with the recommendations, a cost-benefit analysis, one or more reports. And so basically you have to have a scope of plan dimensions. Extend the plan, extent of the plan will be organized, or how it will be organized. And so the scope of the plan dimensions, extent of the plan will be organized, the level of implementation, the range of view and outlook, degree of application and operation, measurement of effectiveness. Assignment of responsibilities. As we mentioned earlier, when you start assigning responsibilities, and there are a lot of people that will sometimes claim to be experts, all of a sudden become, I don't know that area very well. Sort of funny how when that happens. But you want to align your resources and put the best people on the job as possible. Then, of course, assign the responsibilities for trustworthy people that that can get the job done. And evaluate the relationships of, which group is working with this group and, how well that's working. You always want to put the best team together, whether it's in sports or whatever. You want to put the best team that can win, right? And so let's see. So describing procedures and schedules for accomplishments include a recommended solution for any threat or vulnerability with the goal of mitigating the associated risk. As you can see, this builds a lot on Chapter 2. And the reason I'm not touching a whole lot on Chapter 4 here is that Chapter 2, you must know the threats, you must know the vulnerabilities and how that works before you can develop a risk management plan. And so, basically the solution to any of these things is multiple steps. Risk management plans need to be detailed, include a timeline for completion for each step, when and if it can be mitigated. And ultimately, as we say here, it says management is responsible for choosing the controls to implement, and management is responsible for residual risk. Well, yeah, management, senior leadership is it all comes down to them. It's their organization. They have to run it, and so it's up to them to know. Basically, this is what we're implementing. This is what we need to protect, and so IT staff and CIO, Chief Information Officer, go forth and conquer. Right. The affinity diagram, you'll see some of this. You have your threats, you have your recommendations, then you have your vulnerabilities to the different devices. So in your slides, take a look at this and sort of memorize this area as this builds on Chapter 2 a whole lot. The threats, the recommendations, the network, the servers. So dwell on that a little bit and sort of know when we talk about servers, when you think about servers, it's like think about their vulnerabilities. Like, well, there's no antivirus software. There's operating system updates. Unneeded services running, unneeded protocols running, hardware failures, no backups, blah, blah, blah. So the reporting requirements, document and track implementation of accepted recommendations, document the management response to the recommendations. And one of my all-time favorites is create a plan of action and milestones. Wow. Yeah, when I worked for the DOD as a contractor and as a civil servant, I was well acquainted with a POAM. I didn't like poems in school, and I didn't like poems at work either, because these things can be quite tedious and a lot of hard work. Basically, reporting should have the findings, the recommendations, the cost-benefit analysis, As you can see, a lot of this stuff is reiterating Chapter 2 a whole lot. And so that's why the importance of managing the risk is in Chapter 2 is that you must know the threat, the vulnerability, and what's a loss and that kind of stuff. So Chapter 4 is basically a reiteration of Chapter 2, but just a little bit more in depth. Use a cause and criteria diagram. Evaluate, basically like, for instance, evaluating a website. Here's the attack. Well, there was no IDS in place. Inadequate manpower, system's not updated. Not updated because you don't have the manpower to do that. Unmanaged firewall. Well, there's no antivirus software, and the effect is an outage on any of these. So basically, a POAM is a document used to track the progress of your threats or your vulnerabilities or your exploits, and they're used to assign responsibility and to allow management to follow up. And trust me, they will. And this is a living document. You don't just complete it and you're done. This is where in the DoD, the risk management framework, there is continuous monitoring. There's your milestone plan chart. Only lists your major milestones, but there's also what they call inch stones, which can a lot of mini steps in between these. And the Gantt chart. Anytime you do a risk management plan, you'll need to have the Gantt chart, and to show how things are going to be implemented on a timeline. The critical path chart identifies critical tasks to be managed. What is the long tent in the pole, right? What is going to prevent us from doing our job, or from getting from point A to point B? What is critical that will stop us from getting there? Risk management functions, senior management, IT management, system and information owners, functional management, information security management, and security awareness trainers. These are all functional areas that will participate. And so that's pretty much it for Chapter 4 and for Lesson 2. Hopefully you're still awake and you've been listening, but Chapter 2 and Lesson 2 is a biggie, so you must know Chapter 2 before Chapter 4 really makes sense to you. But remember the COVID enablers videos. If you didn't watch them in Lesson 1, let's watch them this week, because your lab and your quiz will actually take place, based on a lot of the COVID enablers. The COVID 5, which is, an ISACA created framework. And so with that being said, thank you for listening, and if you have any questions, feel free to contact me.